thank you for coming out this afternoon. It was really a beautiful drive from Chapel Hill, and it's really great to be here, and I appreciate the fact that you gave up an afternoon to come and hear about revolutionary Russia. How many, by the way, in here, has anyone here been to Russia, the Soviet Union? I expect a good number. How many have had a course on Russian history or the Russian language sometime in the past? Okay, good. What I want to do today is to talk about the Russian Revolution and situate it in historical time. Why did the revolution break out? What course did it take? And then fast forward to 2017 and look at how the event is being remembered in Russia today and why. I want to just, as an overarching frame, point out that revolution struck Russia twice in 1917. So I'll be talking about two revolutions. The first revolution in February or March that year, depending upon which calendar you use. Russia back then was still on the Julian calendar, which by the 20th century was 13 days behind the Gregorian calendar. So the February Revolution was the March Revolution, depending upon what calendar you used. This is the revolution that overthrew the Romanov Dynasty that had been in power for 300 years. And then in October of that year, or November, we had the second revolution when the Bolsheviks came to power. Okay? So can everyone hear me okay? Yep, good. So I want to begin our story not in 1917, but in 1913. Why 1913? Because the Romanov dynasty, which had come to power in 1613, celebrated this 300th anniversary. Now, I want to point out that the Romanovs were very unpopular, not only in Russia, but on the world stage. And they knew it. And this was really before we had an understanding of public relations, right? But the Romanovs, in effect, through all their extravagance at staging a dramatic celebration that the world took notice of. And the idea was to try to overcome the fact that the Romanov dynasty was so unpopular in Russia. On the surface, it was highly successful in terms of pomp and circumstances, and it was an extravagance of pageantry that only big money, and I mean really big, can pull off. Despite that, though, close observers realized that the celebration not only tried to celebrate the Romanovs, but more importantly, it revealed the isolation of the imperial family. And it also revealed considerable social anxiety in Russia. For one thing, 1913 was the year of the infamous anti-Semitic Baylis trial, which captured world public opinion. It was to Russia what the Dreyfus Affair was to France. Has anyone read the novel The Fixer by Bernard Malamud? The novel is based on the Baylis trial, and that came out when I was in high school. I remember reading it, and Malamud won the National Book Award for it. It's a great book, and based on this episode that cast Russia in very negative light on the world stage. A Russian Jew was accused of ritual murder of a Christian child. It was all fabricated, and eventually he was released, but not right away. And it captured a lot of negative public opinion. On March 8th that year, revolutionaries in the underground, this was not legal, marked an event called International Women's Day, which is going to become one of the most celebrated Soviet holidays. And we're going to return to this date when I talk about 1917. Moreover, the State Duma, and the Duma was the Russian parliament. I'll talk about that in a bit as well. Even though the Duma was a pro-government Duma, it protested that the Tsar's closest ministers ignored the Duma. Moreover, one of the most popular writers in the capital, a writer named Andrei Bely, began serializing a novel that year in newspapers. The novel was called Petersburg. It's now available in English. It wasn't until the 1960s or so. But this novel was chock full of what I would call apocalyptic imagery, which sort of put people on edge, people who read it. They were anticipating something dreadful. There was a growing strike movement. In Russia, the strike movement had been repressed following a revolutionary explosion earlier in the century. But in 1912, Tsarist troops murdered several hundred workers who went on strike. And that prompted sympathy strikes throughout the country. And by 1913, there were even more of them. Moreover, Rasputin, whom I know all of you know about, he admonished the Tsar that year to avoid war at all costs. And sometimes Rasputin had it right, and this is probably the most revealing case of that. So why was Nicholas so unpopular? What did he do to not only be unpopular in Russia, but once again on the world stage? Here I want to take a sweeping look go back to the 19th century, which historians often call the long 19th century, beginning with the French Revolution and ending with World War I. And during that period, particularly in the first half, Russia was very much part of Europe. It became Europe could not really imagine statecraft and diplomacy without involving Russia. Russia, earlier in the 19th century, had defeated Napoleon, but at mid-century, Russia suffered humiliating defeat in a war, the Crimean War. And this generated a reform movement in Russia. But the Tsar, who introduced all these reforms in the middle of the 19th century, did so not to bring about a democratic order in Russia, which was the march of progress in Europe at that time, but really to strengthen this autocratic political system. And as a result, the last two czars carried out a very contradictory domestic policy, which is going to generate revolutionary activities. First of all, again, reactionary policies to safeguard the autocracy. They had no intention of giving up any of their power and authority. At the same time, however, the state sponsored modernizing efforts. Some call this state capitalism, in which the state threw all of its resources. Russia didn't have a sizable entrepreneurial class that brought about effective economic reform and change and progress. The government did this. And the result was pretty impressive. Russia had the highest economic growth rate in the world in the 1890s. And then once again, there was a second spurt on the eve of World War I. And what this did, it did fundamentally change society. It sped up urbanization, it created an urban working class, an urban proletariat, and of course, underground groups that supported the rights of these workers. They didn't have any, in effect. So when Nicholas, the last Tsar, came to the throne in 1894, he said, "What is going to happen to me, to all of Russia? I am not prepared to be Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling." This is straight from the horse's mouth. I think we'll let history judge, or let you judge at the end, whether or not Nicholas learned anything during his years in power. Looking back, and let's face it, hindsight is always 20/20. What Russia needed at the start of the new century was not a weak-willed autocrat, but a true Tsar reformer who wanted to bring Russia not only economically into the 20th century, but politically as well. In 1900, Russia was only one of two countries in Europe that lacked a parliamentary system. The other one was Montenegro. Russia had a growing and restless professional middle class that was demanding greater political clout. It was these people who formed the political parties, the revolutionary parties. They were well-educated people who were just frustrated with the lack of political change in Russia. Moreover, the country's revolutionary movement now included, by the turn of the century, Marxist groups, Marxist revolutionaries, who competed against homegrown Russian agrarian socialist groups as this industrial proletariat exploded onto the scene, the result of industrialization efforts that the state had nurtured. Now, during that economic growth in the 1890s and the start of the 20th century, Russia became fully integrated into the world economy. So when world recession hit in 1902, it impacted Russia, even in the villages. Russia had been a major grain exporter. But with grain prices plummeting as a result of this recession, there was a lot of anger in Russian villages. Peasants were torching the estates of the elite. There were industrial strikes. Revolutionary groups were, some of them advocated the efficacy of terror and were assassinating government officials. And this sort of crescendo leading up to 1905. In fact, even the Minister of the Interior was assassinated by revolutionaries. So Russia stumbles into war with Japan in 1904. One of the Tsarist ministers thought a short, successful war would put an end to all this difficulties at home, but of course it's the opposite happened. War turned out to be an Achilles heel for Russia. This war with Japan went poorly for Russia from the start, and in early 1905, tens of thousands of unarmed workers petitioned the Tsar to improve their daily economic lot. Working hours were long, the work week was long, conditions were grim, there was no social legislation at all in effect regulating labor. And government troops murdered over 1,000 of these unarmed workers. They shot and murdered them. And this triggered sympathy strikes across Russia. And as a result, this is the beginning of what we often call the Revolution of 1905. An event that, as the year unfolds, just about all layers of Russian society become politicized. And groups organized, political parties that had formed in the underground now became legal and were competing for political power. In October, the Tsar was very reluctant to grant any concessions. But in October, a national strike that began with the railroad workers brought the government to a halt. It crippled the government. Nicholas, under siege, granted a constitutional system. This document was known as the October Manifesto. But it claimed that he was still an autocrat. And the question remains, can an autocrat have a parliament? Nicholas thought he could remain an autocrat despite a parliament. And what happened, a parliament was elected, and within 3 months the government dismissed it. Elections were held to a second parliament, and the government dismissed it right away as well. And then in 1907, following the dismissal of the parliament for the second time, the government changed the electoral law to disenfranchise most people. For instance, Russia at the time comprised over 100 nationalities. The Russians themselves were in a minority, representing about 49% of the population of the country. Most of these other national groups were now totally disenfranchised. And the equivalent of 250,000 workers voting was the same as one member of the ruling elite voting in one of the urban centers, in the capitals. So it was a weighted voting system, and the system was guaranteed to yield a docile pro-government Duma. Hence my comment earlier that by 1913 even this pro-government Duma was complaining. So keep that in mind. So historians have written, not only historians outside of Russia, but especially in Europe, the United States, and to a certain extent in Russia as well, in writing about Nicholas's reign, have posed two big questions about the reign of the last Tsar. The first one was Nicholas the ineffective and even ill-starred monarch perceived by his contemporaries and subsequently by generations of historians? And secondly, on the eve of World War I, was Russia evolving organically toward a parliamentary system, or was Russia heading toward revolution? This is often presented in the literature as evolution or revolution, right? Now, the answer to the first question is not very controversial. Just about everyone is in agreement, accepting Nicholas's own statement that he was unfit to rule. He had some appealing personal qualities, to be sure, but appealing personal qualities in our leaders is not always necessarily important, right? Important is how effective they are as rulers. He was unfit to rule, he knew it, and just about everyone else knew it as well. Now, the question about evolution or revolution, the linchpin to that question is World War I. That those who argue that Russia was evolving toward a parliamentary system insist that if it hadn't been for World War I, revolution would not have exploded in Russia. Others argue that even without World War I, Russia was moving toward revolution. A British historian, Christopher Reid, recently wrote, "There can be no doubt that in the short term, it was Russia's disastrous performance in the First World War that brought about the final, and I emphasize final, destruction of Tsarism. Let's face it, war is often the midwife of change. War brought down the Habsburg Empire, it brought down the German Empire, it brought down the Ottoman Empire, and World War I also brought down the Russian Empire. But as another historian, also a Brit, Robert Service, put it, no imperial power before First World War was more reviled than the Russian Empire. Okay, we've already suggested that Nicholas was very much unpopular on the world stage. But as Service points out, despite the fact that Nicholas was so unpopular, the revolution that came resulted in the Bolsheviks coming to power, not in the establishment of some sort of liberal democracy. As a result, during the Cold War, Cold War scholarship argued that Russia had been evolving peacefully, or not so peacefully, but it was clearly evolving toward a parliamentary system, and it was war that disrupted this organic evolutionary path. Again, without war, Russia would have established some sort of constitutional system, and there would not have been any revolution in Russia. This was pretty much the standard argument in the 1950s and the 1960s, and part of it had to do with the fact that there was a Cold War raging. If we acknowledge or suggest that the revolution was at all legitimate, then we're suggesting that the Soviet regime is legitimate. And of course, during the Cold War, that was not a popular view at all. A turn, though, and what I think is remarkable, in almost any body of scholarship or in any discipline, there's no general agreement on burning issues, right? There's a lot of debate, and that's what scholarship is about. But on this question of evolution or revolution, until the 1960s, there was pretty much unanimity in view that Russia was World War I. If it hadn't been for the war, Russia would have evolved peacefully. But this changed in the 1960s with several historians, but one in particular who was at the University of Chicago and then later at Columbia, a man named Hameson. And he coined the expression dual polarizations. He argued that the first polarization in Russia was between educated society and the official bureaucracy, educated society and the government, in effect. And that this polarization would have made a February revolution, that is the one that overthrew Nicholas, that type of revolution possible. He also argued that there was a second critical polarization, and that was that educated society was polarized from the masses of the unscrubbed masses of Russia. And that the second polarization was the fatal one, and that combined, the second one meant a radical revolution in Russia. So Hameson even went so far as to say that even without war, there would have been revolution, owing to these two polarizations. Now, at the time, I have to admit that when I was in graduate school in the 1970s, and my own advisor was under the influence of Hameson, the entire generation was, but I never felt comfortable with any argument that claimed inevitability, right? And so I was reluctant to buy into the dual polarization completely. But in thinking about Nicholas's reign, I too became a pessimist, concluding that revolution was bound to happen. Because I thought of several things that had nothing to do with the war. One was Nicholas's character, right? And it was not going to change. He was opposed to granting real concessions and to allowing a parliament to operate in an unfettered manner. Secondly, this lack of political expression, the lack of a real parliament by the 20th century, particularly by the eve of World War I, was simply no longer tenable. Moreover, the government introduced measures of extreme Russification, policies that alienated many of the national minorities across Russia, measures that were totally unnecessary. And then finally, the Russian revolutionary movement didn't go away. The government repressed it, but it couldn't end it. The revolution continued in the underground throughout these years. So why the shift? I want to pause for a moment and talk about why this shift in the 1960s. Why this turn toward a pessimistic turn that Russia, even without World War I, was heading toward revolution. Well, I think we need to look at what was going on both in the Soviet Union at the time and in the United States and in Europe. For one thing, the Soviet Union stopped acting. Stalin died in 1953. His successor, Khrushchev, in 1956, denounced Stalin, called him a tyrant, called him a murderer, and introduced a reform movement and the opening up of the country in teaspoon-sized doses to the outside world. So we saw all this going on in the Soviet Union, and it puzzled us, because we had an image that was totalitarian, but didn't seem to act so totalitarian. Moreover, I think we need to look at the civil rights movement in our own country. Think about the times, how explosive they were. The Vietnam War and the Vietnam War syndrome. And then, intellectually speaking, there was a shift within the historical profession. Up until then, historians studied political history, that is, politics at the top, the history of great people, usually great men, or intellectual history, the history of ideas. But now there was this major shift to what we call social history. And historians, particularly young historians, began to study groups that heretofore had not been part of the historical narrative. Workers, soldiers, peasants, women, national minorities. And when historians studied these groups, they concluded that these groups had a lot of historical agency. They were not passive pawns. They played a role in the historical process. Then, of course, the economic problems. I remember how desperate many college graduates were in the 70s with the difficulties in the economy, lack of jobs. So all these things, this critical-minded mood and the generational shift gave rise to this shift toward a pessimistic understanding of late imperial Russia. Now, this pessimism, this notion that Russia, despite World War, even without war, Russia would have headed toward revolution, this lasted until the end of the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union unraveled in 1991, there was a nostalgic moment in which people began to, if you reject the Soviet project, then you have to look to some usable historical past. What's your historical past? It's the Tsarist system. And there was a lot of people who were anti-Soviet by the end of the Soviet period in Russia, looked very nostalgically and ahistorically at imperial Russia. And the height of this was in the year 2000. Nicholas II and his family, who had been murdered by the Bolsheviks in 1918, they were now canonized as Russian Orthodox saints. He became Saint Nicholas. So there was a nostalgic love affair with imperial Russia at the start of the millennium. Now, Christopher Reid, who the historian I cited earlier, who mentioned that World War I led to the final crisis of Tsarism, he argued recently that in recent decades, Tsarism has been getting away with murder. That is, he was really uncomfortable with this nostalgic and sympathetic love affair with imperial Russia. Because when you look at it under close light, imperial Russia didn't look all that good. It really depended who you were, right? If you were an ordinary Russian, chances were pretty good that your situation would have been pretty grim. And Reid raises a very provocative point here, and that's that, as you know, when we've looked at countries that had been part of the colonial yoke of other countries, countries that had become newly independent after World War I and after World War II, there's been a trend in scholarship to often blame the colonial powers for the problems of these new countries, right? Stemming from the fact that they had been part of the colonial domain. And Reid suggests that maybe we have to look at the Soviet Union as a post-colonial country, the result of imperial Russia. that the same sort of dynamic going on. In other words, he suggests that maybe we should blame Tsarist system for some of the crimes or sins of the Bolshevik or Soviet period. Now, what's the lesson we learned from this shift? Again, unanimity in historical thinking, revolution, only came about as a result of war, and then rejecting this and embracing this view that even without war there would be revolution. And the point I want to make here is that history is always written from the point of view of the present. Always. Historians' views and interpretations are historical, they're subjective, and they reflect the spirit of the times in which they are articulated and the historian's own personal experiences and belief systems. In other words, I'm suggesting here is there's no such thing as quote-unquote objective history. We can't take ourselves out of the historical process. And our own views are historical. They reflect the times. Let's now return to 1917 after this little digression here. I would argue that as a result, Russia went to war in 1914, just as with the war in Japan. The war went very poorly for Russia. The Russian war plans had expected a short, victorious war, not one that would drag out for several years. And by 1917, the elements of the final crisis were fully in place. First of all, there was bitter division within the elite over what form of government Russia should have. Secondly, growing discontent among ordinary people, and this was over bread and butter issues, right? There was no food. It was that simple. Thirdly, the unlikelihood of any reconciliation, these dual polarizations that I mentioned earlier. And then finally, the French and the British ambassadors were secretly discussing with leaders in the Duma the possibility of a palace coup. Overthrow the Tsar. Why were they doing this? Their biggest fear was that Russia would withdraw from World War I, because Russia was bearing the brunt of the war. Casualties were sky high. Nicholas, against the advice of his most sage ministers, left Petrograd, the capital city, for the front to take over the armed forces, leaving the palace in the hands of the Empress Alexandra and the wily Rasputin. They were pretty much in charge, naming minister after minister. It was ministerial leapfrog, and really not since, one pundit put it, not since Caligula appointed his Horus a consul were so many strange political appointments made during war. Now, another element that is going to explain the rapidity with which the Romanov dynasty falls is that during the war, there were rumors that spread, all sorts of rumors, about moral corruption and treason at the very top. Alexandra was German. The Tsar appoints a minister named Sturmer, not a Russian name, while you're fighting a war against Germany. All sorts of publications circulated in enormous press runs, really sort of smutty stuff. I didn't dare show some of it, suggesting that Rasputin was the Empress's lover, and that she was a German princess and receiving German money. There were all sorts of rumors of treason, and what this sort of does, it was so widespread that before 1917 even came, the Romanov dynasty no longer had any legitimacy. It didn't have any authority. There was a desacralization of political power that had taken place, in effect, as a result of all these things going on. So in February 1917, February 23rd, March 8th, depending upon which calendar, angry women, it was International Women's Day, that holiday that revolutionaries had celebrated for the first time. Angry women queuing up for bread, early morning hours, only to find there was no bread yet again. They rioted. They rioted and looted the shops. Unfortunately, some of the factory owners had locked out workers who had demanded better work conditions, as a result of which there were tens of thousands of workers who were not at work. They were in the streets available to join in with the angry women. What happens, the Tsarist government initially dismisses this as a hooligan movement, eventually has the police arrest known revolutionaries, which may have made matters worse, because they were sort of trying to curb this spontaneous ferment, and now that they were off the scene. Soldiers were brought in, and there was a large garrison in the capital city, over 100,000 soldiers. And now some of them refused to shoot, when ordered to shoot, they refused to shoot at the striking workers and angry women. Once they refuse to shoot, this is mutiny. And if they don't succeed, they're going to be hanged. So this was a major day. This was day 4 of the revolution. The soldiers joined the side of the angry workers and angry women. And by the end of the week, the Tsar abdicates not only for himself, but for his son. They turned to his brother, and his brother said, I want nothing to do with this. So the Romanov dynasty is over in a week. The revolution spread by telegram across the country and just about everywhere. This is often called the Unanimous Revolution because throughout urban Russia, there were major demonstrations, celebrations of jubilation over the overthrow of the Romanovs. Sure, there was a small group that were very much opposed to this, but they kept a low profile for good reason. Just about everywhere the same pattern. The members of the Tsarist police are arrested, and the old officials. Now, what I've been suggesting is, despite the fact that, yes, World War I was an important consideration in contributing to the February Revolution, the revolution itself was the result of a long and deep social crisis. This contradiction that I mentioned earlier between capitalist industrialization, which changes the very fabric of society, and an autocratic political system in the 20th century. Attempts at limited constitutionalism after 1905 that brought all these subterraneous tensions out into the open. And then this pattern of Nicholas of granting concessions only when he had no choice, and the minute he had the upper hand, trying to whittle away at them. These were the reasons why revolution broke out. Now, this revolution in February resulted in a very problematic political system known as dual power. There were dual centers of authority and power as a result of the revolution. One representing the bourgeoisie, the elite, the middle classes, the professional classes, and the other the masses. Now, this provisional government was to last until a National Assembly would be held that would decide Russia's political future. They put this off, and I'll talk about why a bit later. Now, at the time, there were no major there were lots of revolutionaries in the capital city, but none of the famous ones, right? Very few of the famous ones. And apart from this provisional government, a Soviet. The word Soviet means council. So the first Soviets appeared in 1905 to organize the strike movement against the government. Soviets emerged everywhere in Russia, in urban Russia at the time, competing with the provisional government. The leaders of the provisional government, the head of the government was a prince, Prince Lvov. And the other major figures in it were, one was a professor of history at Moscow University, professional men or businessmen, or members of the royal family of some sort. So they were pretty much, it was a very, very elite group. They, in their own writings, their memoirs and their diaries, they write and they say, we had no power and authority. It was the Soviet that did, not us. The Soviet had the power to get people on and off the streets. Well, then why didn't the Soviet just take over? Well, an interesting thing here, some of the more moderate, less radical socialists who were good Marxists, they argued that this was Russia's middle class or bourgeois revolution. According to Marx, you couldn't really speed up the historical process, and Russia needed a middle class or bourgeois revolution before it could have a workers' revolution. And when the revolution came, it would establish a government which would be in place for a long time. Just to put this in some perspective, in France, the bourgeois revolution took place when the Bourbon dynasty was overthrown. And it was still, but in 1917, a bourgeois revolutionary state. In the US, 18th century, Britain, 17th century. So you don't rush from the bourgeois stage to the socialist stage. It takes a long time. So they argued, well, that's your revolution, not ours. We have a lot of power and authority, but we'll support the government. We'll support the government. Well, they supported the government because they feared civil war, but the problem was no one discussed the issue of the war. The masses were war-weary. They wanted to end the war. The members of the new government saw themselves as good allies. They wanted to honor Russia's commitment to the war and under no circumstances withdraw from the war. If Russia had withdrawn from the war, the Central Powers would be fighting a one-front war. With having Russia in the war, the Central Powers were fighting a two-front war. Again, the Allies' biggest fear was that Russia withdraw from the war. And this new government insisted, no, don't worry, Russia will honor its commitments. They also wanted to honor its commitments because Russia was promised territorial gains if Russia stayed in the war. But again, this was not discussed between the Soviet and the government. Just a brief word about political parties. The main party of the middle classes, or what the socialists would call the bourgeoisie, they were the Constitutional Democrats, or Cadets. This was the head of their party, Milyukov, a professor of history, who taught at the University of Chicago earlier in the century. And what did they want? They wanted sort of a government like we have, a constitutional system. Then there were Marxist socialists, split into two groups. The Bolsheviks, this was Lenin's party, and the Mensheviks, who were less radical and more mainstream. The Bolsheviks were better revolutionaries. The Mensheviks were better Marxists. The Bolsheviks distorted Marxism, in fact. And then there were the socialist revolutionaries. This was Russia's homegrown, populist, agrarian revolutionary party. And this was Russia's most popular party in 1917. Now, Lenin was not in Russia, as many of you know. He returned in early April. The Germans helped get him there. They realized he was a contagion, that get him back to Russia, he'd foment revolutionary activity, and this would be, the Germans believed, in their best, it would be the best thing for them, and they were absolutely right to a certain extent. Lenin arrives, he gets off the train, there's a large crowd greeting him, and he said immediately he rejects the Soviet support of the provisional government. He calls for all power to the Soviets, all immediately. He says, last month was your bourgeois revolution. Now it's time for our workers' revolution and move towards socialism. Lenin's party published Lenin's, they were called his April Theses, in the local press with a caveat. They wrote and they said, these are the ideas of Lenin only. He hasn't been here in a decade. He doesn't get it. He doesn't know what's going on. Yet within a month, Lenin's political capital soars. His party changes its mind and embraces Lenin's position and demands an immediate move toward all power to the Soviets. Now, you can appreciate that the history of 1917 is enormously complex, and I'm simplifying things, but the basic overarching impulse that I want to underscore here is that between March and October, these middle-class politicians in the provisional government sought to create some sort of constitutional order amid deepening social and political disorder caused by the war. What happens is the government falls in April over the issue of the war. It collapses. And this is why Lenin's party then embraced Lenin's views. A coalition government is created in which the socialist parties join the new government except for one party. Which party does not join the new government? The Bolsheviks. And there are now, in the course of the year, 3 consecutive coalition governments, each of which collapses over crisis. And as a result of this growing radicalization during the year, the Bolshevik slogan, "Land, Peace, and Bread," becomes increasingly more popular among rank-and-file Russians. Now, in the summer, one of these crises led to an attempt at a military dictatorship. The head of the last three coalition governments was a moderate socialist named Kerensky. He appointed a new commander-in-chief. And by the way, right after the February Revolution, the Petrograd Soviet introduced Order Number 1, which created soldiers' committees in every military unit that were more powerful than the officers. This led to an erosion of law and order and discipline, basically, within the armed forces, contributing to a disastrous result in the war. In any event, Kerensky appoints a new commander-in-chief. They negotiate to establish a military dictatorship. The problem was Kerensky believed that he'd be the head of this dictatorship, and Kornilov believed he would. This event, which took place in August, totally radicalized much of Russia, as a result of which, across urban Russia, in elections to these Soviets, these workers' councils, workers' and soldiers' councils now, Bolsheviks were winning majorities everywhere in Russia. Don't forget, Lenin's arguing land, peace, and bread, all power to the Soviets. And now the Soviets, through elections at the local level, pretty much ran the Soviets in Russia. What does Lenin conclude? Why don't we run Russia as a result? Now, what also makes 1917 such a complicated historical phenomenon is that this was a year of overlapping revolutions. I was tracing the political revolution. I want to point out that there was a simultaneous Peasant Rebellion that had a life of its own and a chronology of its own. If peasants have to farm the fields, they're not going to be out trying to seize the land of someone else, right? But once the harvest is in, then it's another story. And as the army began to erode and desertion became widespread by fall of 1917, tens of thousands of armed soldiers returned to the villages, and they began to seize the land and bring about land reform that the government had postponed as a result of the war. Then in October, the workers' revolution resumes when the Bolsheviks seize power. And again, there was a National Assembly of Soviets. The majority of people who came were in favor of Soviet power. Those who were opposed withdrew, making that majority even seem more prominent, and the Bolsheviks declared a Bolshevik government. Moreover, already from the start of 1917, there were multiple revolts among the non-Russian peoples along the periphery of Russia. This was true in the Baltic, in Finland, in Ukraine, in the Caucasus, and in Central Asia. Each of these is a separate story with a chronology of its own and causes and effects of its own, unfolding within the story of this larger revolutionary event. Now, when the Bolsheviks seized power in October or early November 1917, this immediately triggers civil war. There's a lot of debate when the Civil War begins. At the time, contemporaries saw it beginning right then and there, because there was opposition from the very start. But the Bolsheviks didn't dare postpone these elections to this National Assembly. Remember I mentioned that the provisional government would be provisional until it held a constituent assembly, right? Well, why didn't they hold the elections earlier? They didn't hold the elections earlier because the Liberal Party that wanted a constitutional system only got 5% of the vote. And they knew they would. They knew they weren't popular. They knew they only represented a small social stratum. If you look at the results of the election, the Socialist Revolutionaries, this peasant agrarian revolutionary party, 41%. The Bolsheviks got a quarter of the vote, and they won everywhere they were. They won in urban Russia, and they won in all the military garrisons. They weren't in the villages, they didn't win there. The Mensheviks, just a handful, but all socialist parties, these three plus there were national, like Finnish socialist revolutionaries, Ukrainian Mensheviks, Ukrainian socialist revolutionaries. Combined in Russia, the socialist parties polled over 80% of the popular vote in Russia's freest elections to date. And I think what this underscores is, often because what we would have liked to have seen would be a constitutional system that was like ours, right? And it didn't result in that. So we pose the question, why did the constitutional democrats fail? I think the real question is, why did the radical form of socialism triumph over the other more moderate forms? Because Russian political culture by this time was very different than ours. The impulse was socialist in many ways. Now, I mentioned that October triggers civil war. Civil war breaks out right away, and it's very complicated with 6 overarching phases. Already in 1918, there's a clash with Czechoslovak soldiers that almost overthrows Soviet power. Well, Czechoslovak soldiers, there's no Czechoslovakia. Well, that was the point. As part of the Versailles the peace negotiations, the territories that became part of the future Czechoslovakia, Bohemia, Moravia, and Slovakia, were part of the Habsburg Empire, and they were fighting against Russia. Many of their troops were taken prisoner of war, and they were in Russia. Future Czechoslovak leaders at Versailles said, look, let our prisoners of war travel across Siberia, sail around the world, and they'll fight against the Central Powers. They want to make a claim for establishing a Czechoslovakian state. What they did, they shot their way across Siberia, overthrowing Soviet power just about everywhere, underscoring how vulnerable it was. And then there's Allied intervention. Britain, France, the United States, Japan all sent troops to Russia at this time. Their effort was not united, but it gave credence to Bolshevik propaganda that the outside world was against them. And there are some wonderful accounts of people who were anti-Bolshevik, but once these foreigners were in Russia, they became very patriotic and supported the Bolsheviks. Then there was the armed opposition to the Bolsheviks among the former military, known as the White Movement. And it was concentrated in 4 parts of Russia. But all of these, the south, the Baltic, the north, and east of the Volga, this was all in the periphery. The Bolsheviks held the heartland throughout the Civil War. A new Polish state emerged on the rubble of World War I, and it immediately went to war against the Soviet state, claiming that territory of the new Soviet state. The Poles won this skirmish, and as a result, the new Polish state, a third of it was non-Polish. It included lots of Belarusians and Ukrainians. And the Soviets are going to take that back on the eve of World War II. And then once the whites were defeated, the Bolsheviks had to contend with armed uprisings among Russia's peasants. The peasants, the government took their grain. When it had something to exchange, it exchanged it. When there was nothing left to exchange, they just took their grain to fight the Civil War. The peasants revolted. It was a very serious threat to the Bolsheviks. Their slogan was, we're for the Soviets, but get rid of the communists, that is the Bolsheviks. They didn't realize that the communists and Bolsheviks were the same. The Bolsheviks had changed their name during the Civil War. And then these territories that had broken away and became independent, it took the Bolsheviks until the mid-1920s to regather most of this territory. But the new Soviet state is smaller. It lost Finland, it lost Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, it lost parts of Ukraine and Belarus to Poland, and it lost the state, what's today Moldova. Now, historians, the past 10 or 15 years, earlier we'd look at the World War I, we'd look at the Revolution, we'd look at the Civil War as sort of separate entities. But now the new trend is to look at this period from 1914 to 22 as a continuum, as one process. And if we look at the enormity of human losses, it's mind-boggling. 9.1 million casualties in World War I, 7 to 8 million deaths during the Civil War, of which the majority were civilian deaths owing to famine, the influenza epidemic, disease. 1 to 2 million emigrated. Who emigrated? The peasants? No. It was the educated elite fled. And then at the very end of the Civil War, an estimated 5 million deaths through famine. If it hadn't been for concerted famine relief from the American Relief Association, the British Save the Children Fund, the Vatican, and other church groups in the world, and civic organizations, there would have been a mind-boggling number of dead from famine. In the province I studied, population 3 million, 90% were classified as starving, fed daily by rations from these outside groups. So what I'm suggesting here is that the enormity of this convulsion, of this continuum of crisis, absolutely shattered all social relations, any sense of normality in public life and in civic life. Russia, often is said that Russians like a strong leader. They're prone towards some sort of autocratic system. Well, come on. It's not part of their genetic code, but it is part of their political culture. What I'm suggesting here is that the Russia political culture did have democratic impulses, but these were starved during the Revolution and Civil War. And that the raw human material that was left with which to build the great socialist utopia had been totally brutalized. Yet the Bolsheviks remained in power until 1991. They remained in power because they had legitimacy. They alienated many social groups. They had enemies from within, but they also had many groups that that supported them, and for this reason legitimated the system. It's often been called the greatest event of the 20th century for good reason. The fact that a completely different political system, the world had never seen anything like this before. Now, after World War I, again after World War II, the colonial world breaks up. All these former colonies are becoming independent. Many are looking to the Soviet Union as a model. It also, the fact that the Soviet Union existed impacted Western democracies. I don't think there would have been a New Deal in the United States hadn't there been a Soviet Union. Look at the Red Scare in this country in the 1920s. We were afraid of our own workers and the grim social conditions as a result of the Great Depression. And then, of course, the Cold War, in which two universalizing ideologies, communism and capitalism, competed for the hearts and the minds of everyone throughout the world, defining our own lifetime for the most part, right? Now, what's the fate of the revolution in Putin's Russia? A reminder that history is written from the perspective of the present. Putin in 2001, a year after coming to power, said, Russia in the past century overfulfilled its plans for a revolution. And then a little later, when he was asked about revolutions and things, he said, it's high time to say firmly that this cycle has ended. Хватит уже. Enough is enough. So keep in mind that Russia, in losing World War I, didn't have any World War I memorials or monuments or statues. They didn't talk about the war. And what happened with the 100th anniversary of World War I in 2014, Russia opened this enormous new Poklonnaya Gora in Moscow World War I memorial. Putin was there with the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. They argued that World War I proved the heroism of the Russian people. And just as before the revolution cast a shadow on World War I, which people didn't talk about, the revolution was the foundation narrative of the whole Soviet experiment. Now, 1917 is in the shadow of World War I. In other words, Putin wants to discredit the notion or concept of revolution. He doesn't want people to think that they should think conspiratorially or in those sorts of terms. So right now, this new books coming out in the revolution, mostly taking on sort of a tone of, sort of an apologetic tone, regrets, the revolution a lost cause. But I think I'm not sure that the verdict should be in yet. And for one thing, the revolution opened up new possibilities for politics that in some grim circumstances still remain vital today. And it led to the emergence of a new political image of the world. Even failed revolutions, if that's what the Russian Revolution was, had ideals which even today sometimes still inspire. Thanks for your attention, and I'll be happy to take your questions.